اوكي شيخ، تفضل ان شاء الله تعالى.
إن شاء الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد أجمعين. صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Brothers and civilizations of the iconic figures of the 20th century who have worked hard to overcome the challenges Muslims have been facing since the colonial occupations of the Muslim world. And today we are studying a very, very important figure. Last week we studied Muhammad Abdu, who had been highly influential, even though his legacy has been disputed by the extreme conservatives. His efforts to revive the Islamic tradition and revive the Islamic thought has been applauded by many, many intellectuals and scholars. The same way we are studying today another iconic figure, Muhammad Iqbal. I want to warn you, I want to caution you that whatever we say here are only glimpses. We cannot do justice to these important personalities because their contributions are extremely important. They are of a extensive and intensive nature. So these brief sessions cannot cover them, but our purpose here is to make you understand something of the greatness of these personalities so that we can inspire ourselves and motivate ourselves to study them and their thought in greater details, inshallah. So in this session, I would briefly mention the milieu, the origins and education of Dr. Iqbal, Allama Iqbal, and his training in Europe, his transformation, and his role as a poet and visionary, and his call for Muslim awakening and Islamic reform. Finally, briefly, his legacy and wisdom. Iqbal, the poet, philosopher, educator, visionary, and social reformer, was born in a critical time. Of course, we mentioned the milieu of Muhammad Abdu is the same. But in his case, critical time in the history of India and the Muslim world. And he stood between the four worlds of British colonialism and post-colonialism in India, European colonialism and the deep scars it had inflicted upon the entire Muslim world, Muslim sense of pride, the worlds of Islamic and the Western civilizations, and finally the worlds of tradition and modernity. By tradition, we mean the Islamic tradition, and of modernity. And Iqbal struggled, he operated within these four worlds, and his mind was shaped under these forces, and his life and career were an attempt to build bridges and forge a new vision to transform the world. Muhammad Iqbal was born in 1873 or 1876. There are, some controversies. It's a contentious issue among historians. But he was born in Sialkot, Punjab, in the undivided India. Of course, Pakistan was not born. He is often known as Allama Iqbal or simply Iqbal. Allama means an outstanding scholar. His ancestors were Brahmins of Kashmiri origin. Of course, as is the case with many Muslims all over India, conversion to Islam came not only for the lower caste, as some people think, They came from Brahmins, the highest in the hierarchical caste system. Uh, Brahmins of Kashmiri origin, and one of his own ancestors converted to Islam, and of course, Kashmir went through the lot of, under British in cooperation with some of the Hindu rulers. Uh, Muslims were forced, some of these uh, converts faced pressure to leave Kashmir. So Iqbal's grandfather Muhammad Rafiq migrated from Kashmir and settled down in Sialkot. His father Nur Muhammad, he was a tailor by profession. He was a devout Muslim and a highly spiritual man. This was the time when Tasawwuf, Sufism was permeated all levels of the society. So, especially among the ordinary Muslims, it penetrated the society and, of course, influenced them. And of course, Tasawwuf was responsible for converting great number of people in Kashmir and other places. Actually, so it has a very positive contribution, as scholars, historians have said, uh, in the propagation of Islam in the subcontinent as well as in Indonesia, Malaysia, and China as well. His father was fond of inviting scholars and Sufis to his home, and he would listen to their devotional talks. And of course, he was moved to tears as we would listen to the talks and the Quran recitations and things like that. His mother, although illiterate, was also a pious woman. Of course, Iqbal, praises her. He has a poem honoring her, honoring motherhood, how they were responsible for all of the moral, ideals and values that he imbued as he was a child. Iqbal credited his father and mother for his spiritual leanings. Of course, his father was a lover of the Quran who advised his son read the Quran, but while doing so, visualize it as a fresh revelation to you from God. Every time you read the Quran, in order for you to gain benefit from the Quran, you need to visualize that it is God is speaking directly to you through this book. And Iqbal would say this is the greatest gift anybody could ever give him in his life. Iqbal, thanks to such influences, he was a diligent reader of the Quran. He was always captivated by the miracle of the Quran, and he would be moved to tears reading and hearing the Quran, recited Quran. Iqbal's education began with the study of the Quran, Arabic and Persian, with the essentials of Islamic faith in the maktab, actually, the Islamic madrasa or school. His teacher, Maulavi Mir Hassan, was his first mentor, who early on sensed his precocious mind. He was a very intelligent teacher, and he sensed that Iqbal had a very, very sharp mind. He has a great potential. So he inspired him to nurture his talents and excel in his studies. From his school years early on, while he was in his teens, Iqbal he had this love for poetry, started writing poems. He would send them to a famous poet, Dag, who used to correct them. After a while, the celebrated poet wrote to Iqbal that his poems needed no correction. In 1895, Akbar graduated and moved to Lahore for higher studies. Still, this is undivided India. There was no partition at that time. Iqbal was uh, born before the founding of Pakistan. He came under the influence of the famous Islamicist Professor Thomas Arnold, the celebrated author of The Preaching of Islam. This is a great work that I would recommend everyone to study. Although an Orientalist, he was an objective scholar sympathetic to Islam. His work, The Preaching of Islam, backed up by his diligent research, was a strong rebuttal of the Orientalist fallacy that Islam was spread through the sword. Of course, he refuted and he proved through extensive research no Islam in many places in the largest in Indonesia, Malaysia, and China, elsewhere, largely everywhere, largely it was spread through peaceful method. Big people were exposed to the beautiful examples and character of Muslims and the beauty of Islam as manifested through their performance or actions. Iqbal received his training in philosophy under Thomas Arnold and he earned his master's. Arnold sensed the intellectual potential, just as Mir Hassan sensed it. Arnold also sensed the intellectual great potential of Iqbal and advised him to pursue higher studies in England. In 1905, Iqbal enrolled at the Cambridge University to specialize in philosophy and, of course, in law. Thanks to his great intellectual endowments, he returned home not with one degree but 3 degrees. Two from the Cambridge University. He was called to bar, one in law and another in philosophy. Simultaneously, he got a PhD in philosophy from Germany, Munich University, for his dissertation on the development of metaphysics in Persia. Recognizing his intellectual caliber, the university waived the residential requirements for PhD, so he could write his dissertation, in England, and he was awarded the degree of PhD. His stay in England exposed him to European culture and worldview. His critical mind was at once inspired and repulsed by what he saw. Iqbal admired the scientific achievements of the West, but at the same time, he was repulsed by the rampant materialism and the decadent moral decline of the West. And he predicted that this civilization cannot survive given the way it is going. He was shocked to experience the double standards of the European colonialist. Still going on, you see, educating liberal morality and democracy at home, they practice ruthless colonial exploitation abroad, as well as at home against the working classes. His research on Western philosophy prompted him to delve deeper into the sources of Islamic philosophy and spirituality. It made him aware of the depth and resourcefulness of the Quran for creating a new man, a new world, a new vision. Initially, like Imam Ghazali, Iqbal went through a period of doubt, short. However, thanks to his close reflections on the Quran, the Prophet's Sirah, and Rumi, he regained his faith. This is different from, Ibn Arabi. He didn't like Ibn Arabi's approach to religion, to Islam, but he recognized the dynamic nature of Rumi's tasawwuf, which to him was based on Quran. So he regained his faith. He took Rumi as his mentor in his intellectual forays. Iqbal returned to India as a changed man, full of vigor and confidence in his Islamic roots. His awareness of the Muslim decadence in the face of the virility of the West, led him to take up his pen to arouse Muslims from their slumber. Iqbal, although a born poet, said, like Rumi himself, he had no love for poetry's sake. He had no regard for poets. Even some of the so-called poets, Sufi poets like Hafiz, because he thought their poems, instead of stirring the people to act in the world, to fulfill the real mission that God has entrusted with, it dulls them, it tranquilizes them. For him, it was merely poetry was a medium, the most powerful medium at the time for social change. So he, he considers, his use of poetry, and he only used it as a medium for social change to remake the man and the world. Iqbal wrote in Persian, English, and Urdu, although he also mastered Arabic, German, and Latin. However, he wrote most of his poems in Persian in the models of Masnavi of Rumi. Rumi's Masnavi is often known as a commentary of Quran in Persian. It's a spiritual commentary. Iqbal's works in English included his dissertation on the development of metaphysics in Persia, Stray Reflections, which is a diary charting the course of his intellectual journey. Thirdly, his lectures compiled as the Reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. This is a very, very lasting, enduring contribution. His poetry collections include Shikwa complaint to God. Is you know mentioning the challenges Muslims are facing and the decadent state the Ummah has fallen. Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the perfect man, perfect exemplar of humankind, the decadent state of the Ummah, complaining to God about the sad state of Muslims. And then, of course, this is followed by Jawab Shakwa, answer from God. Why Muslims are in this decadent state. It's very, very interesting. These epoch-making poems are intended to teach Muslims that they have fallen into disgrace because of their own laziness and lack of faith. He pinpoints, still this kismat. What can we do? This tawakkul, this resignation, complacency, you know, the misguided interpretation of the divine decree, qada and qadr. What can we do? We are at the mercy of God. Definitely we are at the mercy of God, but God has given us the resources, the physical and mental and spiritual, and also created the world for us to master it. Sakhara lakum. Of course, he reads these Quranic verses carefully to see the dynamism of the Quran. So Muslims have lost it because they have lost the true understanding, true vision of Islam. He calls on Muslims to arise and work on self-development as a precursor for changing the world. In 1915, he wrote his long poem Asrar Khudi, Secrets of Self. It was translated by one of his teachers. You see, his teachers in Cambridge, Professor Nicholson admits, this great intellectual that was Iqbal, and he translates his Asrar Khudi into English. Of course, there are other Orientalists, Massignon and others, top Orientalists at the time, who also recognized this great thinker. Of course, Muslim intellectual ulama did not really recognized, except for a few exceptions, like Muhammad Asad, Maududi to some extent, and Abul Hassan al Nandvi and others recognize, the great potential of the thought, the deep reflections of Iqbal and his reform work. It was admired in the East and the West. This was followed by another collection called Romose Bekhudi, Mysteries of Selflessness. Iqbal was an opponent of pantheistic Sufism associated with Ibn Arabi, actually. In Islamic, of course, pantheism, there is Hinduism steeped in pantheism, and tasawwuf at the hands of Ibn Arabi and others. Some considered it pantheistic, and Iqbal considered it pantheistic. So he considered this concept, this philosophy, this ideology antithetical to the Quranic worldview of activism. Because Quran calls us to act in the world, not just to sleep, not to retire to the caves and the mountains. We have to take on the responsibility of shaping the world according in the mold of the Quranic vision. In the first work, he calls for the development of the Islamic personality. Asrar Khudi, this is a call for Muslims to develop the Islamic personality. And he says that Islamic personality cannot be developed in isolation, in retreat. It has to be developed while interacting with the society. You cannot detach yourself from society. So he really saw the real, the true vision or Quranic vision. In the second one, he teaches how the individual should interact with society. In his ideas on self, society, and life, of course, deeply influenced by Quran as well as Maulana Rumi, because that was his tasawwuf. He refuted pantheism, recognized the value of true Islamic spirituality, which according to Akbar, Islamic personality, spirituality, the heart of it is contemplation in action. We need to act. And while doing so, we should commune with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We should contemplate the nature. Because the perfect exemplar of a spiritually attained man is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He points out that the Sufi masters today call people to retreat, to stay in the state of fana and ecstasy. Of course, there are others who follow, among them, there are those who follow the example of the Prophet. Yes, they commune with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They go into the spiritual retreat and ecstatic state, but they come back to the world to act. So, to change the world according to the insights and they have derived from their communion with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To get his message across to a wider audience, Iqbal followed it up with a collection of Urdu poems. Of course, Persian was the language of the elite, the upper classes, and of course, Urdu was the language of the common man. So he wanted to address the entire, all levels of society, the intellectuals, the scholars, as well as the layman. So Urdu poems called Bange Dara, the sound of the caravan bell. You know, to wake up, to stir up, to 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 act, to take on the responsibility, to wake up from the slumber. And another masterpiece, Payam-e Mashriq, the message of the East, which was a response to God's West, his Diwan. Yes. 2 years later, he wrote Zabur Ajam, Persian Psalms, followed by Javid Name, a long poem, Persian poem, recognized as his masterpiece. Javid Name was dedicated to his son Javid Iqbal. It was written as a counterpart to Dante's Divine Comedy. In 1928, Iqbal delivered a series of 6 lectures on the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. These lectures were given in various Indian universities, and of course, he was addressing the intellectuals to take up the challenge of reforming, reconstructing Islamic thought. And this, there are many, many studies on Iqbal and his thought, and especially the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. It's the unique work. My own professor, Charles Adams, used to consider it as the only work on the philosophy of Islamic religion. It was an attempt at reconciling Muslim theology with European philosophy and science in a very personal way. Of course, Iqbal saw this. He mastered both the Islamic tradition, intellectual tradition, and the Western tradition. He saw, the crisis facing humanity is what we see today, the othering of others, the othering, this racism and this divide between East and the West, white and black, and Muslim and non-Muslim. Humanity has divided themselves and created these walls. We need to break these walls. And for him, the Quranic message came to break the walls and unite humanity by a new vision of freedom and liberation, freedom of thought. Even Khatamun Nubuwa, even of course, I mentioned Abdu also mentioned that point. For Iqbal, the doctrine of Khatmun Nubuwa means no more prophecy now. So the vacuum should be filled by Muslims exercising the reasoning and understanding the message of the Quran and relate it to the conditions, the circumstances this face, the challenges this face, whether it is challenges in thought, in ideology, or in customs and practices, and any other challenge. Iqbal is convinced that with the Quran understood properly, Muslims can overcome any challenges and free themselves and liberate humankind by first liberating themselves. We can, of course, this is the same idea that was mentioned by the leader of the Muslim delegation as he was questioned by the commander-in-chief of the Persian forces, Rustam, who asked Rabi ibn Amir, who happened to be a black man. Initially, Rustam refused to talk to him because he thought a black man is not his equal. So he wanted Muslims to replace him. The Muslims said, he is our leader. If you want to talk to us, you need to talk to us through him. So he had no choice but to talk to Muslims through their leader, Rabi ibn Amir. And Rabi ibn Amir saw the slavery, that is rampant slavery. And when Rustam asked, what is your mission? Why have you come out of Arabia? Are you looking for pasture for your camels? Or are you looking for food because you are starving? Are you looking for shoes because most of them were barefooted? Rabi ibn Amir replied confidently, Allah ibta'athana linukhrij al-ibad min ibadat al-ibad ila ibadat Allah. God has commissioned us to liberate humankind from the slavery of mankind to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and from the tyranny of religions to the justice of Islam, and from the narrowness of the world to the spaciousness of this world and the next world. You know, Iqbal was imbued by this kind of liberating message. In 1935, his most important collection of Urdu poetry came out, Bala Jibril, Gabriel's Wing, which contained the famous hymn on the Mosque of Cordova, because Iqbal visited Cordova, and while there, he asked permission to pray in the mosque because Muslims were denied the permission to pray in the mosque of Cordova. He prayed and he shed tears, and then he wrote his poem, which is really gives an inspirational message for Muslims to wake them up, to analyze the reasons for what happened to the civilization which led the world. 1 year later, followed the Urdu Diwan Darb Kalim, the Stroke of Moses. It contained bitter critique of the political and religious situation. Iqbal blamed Muslim ulama and intellectuals and politicians as the leaders for the sad state of Muslims. And his mission was to arouse them from their sleep. Iqbal died on 21st of April 1938 after a long period of illness. Although he never stopped working, he penned his parting words before his death: the departed melody may return or not. The zephyr from Hijaz may blow again or not. The days of this fakir poor man have come to an end. Another seer may come or not. Earlier he had said, I tell you the sign of a true believer. When death comes, there is a smile on his lips. And he died with a smile, and of course uttering the word La ilaha illallah. Iqbal is considered the intellectual father of Pakistan. Of course, you know, as an Indian Muslim, looking at the whole partition, I feel sorry for what had happened. It has been responsible for many of the things Muslims in India are experiencing. And the Pakistan itself is not in the best of shape, but you cannot blame Iqbal for it because he was a visionary. He considered nationalism as antithetical to the Islamic worldview. He had nothing to do with building a nation for nation's sake. Because he was opposed to nationalism and considered it as antithetical to the Islamic worldview, he saw the need to construct a modern society inspired by the Quran and the prophetic example, where brotherhood, social justice, and solidarity and equality among all classes of people, because he comes from a Hindu milieu of caste system. And also he saw the caste class rivalry created by the extreme capitalism in the West. So he saw the need for reconstructing the society using the Quranic model. So that was his impetus, because he thought there is a need to build a society where you can point, this is the society envisaged by the Quran, so this is the way to call people to Islam in action. They will see the beautiful example of Islam in action, where it embraces all classes, all castes, and, and calls for the brotherhood of humankind and peace in the world through this kind of a vision. So his impetus to propose the founding of Muslim, to develop a free Muslim personality and implement the high Quranic ideals. That was, but also he knew at the same time that he is a seer, he is a sage, he's a visionary. He said a poet or seer can inspire a vision, but such a vision, high vision, may flourish or die at the hands of politicians. Sadly, this is what we see happening now. That noble vision, that in, some people say what the founding principle vision of Pakistan, what happened to it at the hands of the politicians. Iqbal's greatest contribution, however, was his effort to reform the Muslim thought. They are based on his close study of the Quran and both the Islamic and the Western intellectual traditions. Iqbal realized the need to reform Muslim thinking as a prerequisite for reawakening Muslims because he, he mentioned the sad state of Muslims, how Quran has been reduced to a book that is recited to comfort the dying person. So it's a tranquilizer. Of course, he's not denying that Quran read on a dying person may soothe, may ease, definitely. But that is not the main function of the Quran. Quran came to call us, to give life to us, to awaken us, to revive us. And he says it revived the Arabs who were downtrodden and backward, illiterate. It educated them, it mentored them, it awakened them from the slumber and sleep. And then they took on the world and they mastered all the obstacles. Nothing was, nothing posed as a challenge for them that they could not overcome. With their faith in God Almighty, faith in Tawheed, faith in the Quran, and inspired by the Quran and the prophetic example, they mastered. So, to fulfill their mission as God's vicegerents and say, envisaged by the Quran. But he considered the inherited Muslim theology, the beliefs and practices as propagated by the ulama and the Sufis at the time, they are incompetent, utterly inadequate to make Muslims, to embolden Muslims, empower Muslims to face the challenges. They are responsible for the sad state of Muslims. He saw Ibn Arabi's concept of Wahdatul Wujud, although he never declared Ibn Arabi a kafir. He said he may have done it out of sincerity, but I'm sorry to say he is mistaken. This is a wrong way of interpreting the message of the Quran, Wahidatul Wujud. And similar, of course, this was the same idea of Sirhindi. He had learned it from Sirhindi, another Sufi sheikh master who opposed Wahidatul Wujud and replaced it with Wahidatul Shuhud. That, you know, although there are others who say this way of looking at Ibn Arabi is Wahdatul Wujud, Wahdatul Wujud itself is not coined by Ibn Arabi. Uh, we are not entering into this discussion, but definitely his ideas at the hands of many Sufis became a kind of drug to tranquilize and keep Muslims in a deep sleep. You know, so pantheistic ideas uh, of Wahdatul Wujud, and this is similar ideas in Hinduism as the major culprits for the Muslim downfall. They thought the world was a mere illusion, and that self-realization was the highest goal of human life. But for that's why he's talking about the self, the secrets of the self, and the secrets of selflessness. So Islam, Quran calls us to develop our self, and this self is developed through action, struggle, facing the challenges boldly, thinking through the problems. So while doing so, we are in communion with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are seeking the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it calls to action, call to action. The main purpose of the Quran is to awaken in man the higher consciousness of his manifold relations with Allah and nature and the universe. Muslims' loss of real identity of the Khudi self had kept them away from the genuine spirit of Islam. Iqbal's ideal for individual and social life is self-affirmation. You don't deny the self, you affirm the self and recognize your real potential. It's not self-negation. It's not world renunciation. These are self-negation and self-denial, the teachings of the Hindu and Sufi pantheists, and he is refuting, um, attacking those who interpreted the Quranic vision in this way. He propounded a doctrine of self in his major works such as Asrar Khudi, Secrets of the Self, and Asrar Bekhudi, Secret of Selflessness, and Message from the East, Doctrine of Khudi. He called for the Muslims to shake off their complacency and fatalistic mindset and develop the true Islamic personality and embark on changing the world inspired by the Quranic vision. Iqbal discerned the beauty of the Quran in its dynamism and message of humanism and mercy. He considered Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as the model for Muslims to emulate. But of course, this emulation cannot be like the monkey imitating, as many people, literalists have conceived it, legalists have conceived it. He discovered in these sources a creative impulse that can direct the raw materials of history into a positive moral channel. However, to translate this dynamic impulse, he called for the opening of the door of ijtihad to reformulate the laws of the Sharia to respond to the modern challenges. He said that the mechanism for change is built into the Sharia itself. So it's the Sharia itself can adapt itself to changing circumstances. It cannot, because life must move on. Change cannot be contained in a bottle. Muslims cannot stop the change. Change must take place. But this change, in order to be Islamic, must be organically linked to the sources, and the way to do it is through ijtihad. But ijtihad should not be limited, cannot be done by scholars in isolation, but it should also be social scientists and professionals in various fields. It's a very, very creative way of looking at it. He also interpreted ijma as a method of applying the concept of shura to provide the basis for an Islamic democratic system. Of course, Iqbal provided a blueprint for a dynamic Islamic state or Muslim society, definitely. In Iqbal's vision, the above four concepts are closely connected with the central Islamic doctrines of Tawheed and Jihad. Tawheed for Iqbal is a call for liberation of humans from the idols and shackles associated with priesthood and despotism and monarchy and other forces that exploit humankind and deny them their dignity, honor, equality, and justice. So he blames in monarchy and priesthood, the ulama as well included, were responsible for exploiting mankind and denying them their dignity, called for an all-out jihad. Tawheed, when understood correctly, demands on Muslims to an all-out struggle, and the struggle should continue as long as we breathe our last. But it is not just occupation for the sake of occupation, military, warfare to, occupy lands. No, it is to free humankind, to pave the way for the total liberation and put an end to exploitation and slavery and oppression and injustice. It is this constant struggle that helps the self to develop its potential of mastery of the self and the world. When properly understood, the above concepts form a coherent system. You see, Iqbal saw the coherent consistency of Islamic teachings. It guarantees to transform society into a universal brotherhood that embraces the entire human family. He expresses a view of Islamic brotherhood. Ours is China, India, and Arabia. We are Muslims, and the entire world is our native land. Our call to prayer echoes in the valleys of the West, and none could check the current of our storm. Kubar's message was based on a synthesis of the ideals of Islam with the scientific achievements of the West. He wrote, the East saw God but failed to see the world of matter. The West got embroiled in the world and neglected war. Iqbal was one of the greatest thinkers and intellectuals of the century. Like Godey, he was a seer and humanist. His mission through his poems was to revitalize civilization. He inspired millions and continues to inspire them through his poems and works. His dynamic philosophy continues to inspire his readers with hope and a call to action to create a better world. Let me finish this by citing of Iqbal's work is full of wisdom. People who have no hold on their process of thinking are likely to be ruined by liberty of thought. What a beautiful statement it is. If thought is immature, liberty of thought becomes a method of reducing humankind to the status of animals. That is what we see unfolding right in front of our eyes. And he calls on everyone be aware of your own self worth. Use all your power to achieve it. Create an ocean from a dewdrop. Do not beg for light from the moon. Get it from the spark within you. Because we have that potential to transcend ourselves, to achieve, to overcome the limitations, and to master the world. And he cites verses after verses how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have created the world for us, not to sleep through it, but to master the world. Preserve your history and become everlasting. Of course, all of his reforms, he he roots them in history. He reads the history of Islam, reinterprets it. Because without history, you cannot. You are cut off. You are uprooted. So preserve your history and become everlasting. Receive new life from the time that have gone by. Nations are born in the hearts of poets and seers. They prosper and die in the hands of politicians. If faith is lost, there is no security and there is no life for him who does not adhere to religion. The Westerners have lost the vision of heaven. They go hunting for the pure spirit in the belly. The pure soul takes not color, takes not color and scent from the body. And communism has nothing to do save with the body. I tell you the sign of a believer. When death comes, there is a smile on his lips. I lead no party, I follow no leader. I have given the best part of my life to a careful study of Islam, its law and polity, its culture, its history and literature. Look at the evils of the world around you and protect yourself from them. Relevant. All of us should learn this wisdom. Our teachers give all the wrong messages to our youth. In fact, Iqbal's thought, Iqbal's work is a call for the youth to wake up, to arouse them, to inspire them, to motivate them, to realize their full potential. So, but he says our teachers give all the wrong messages to our youth since they take away the natural flair from the soul. Take it from me that all knowledge is useless until it is connected with your life. Because the purpose of knowledge is nothing but to show you the splendors of yourself. Beauty. A community which is inspired by feelings of ill will towards other communities is low and ignoble. This is what we see in India and all around the world. Xenophobia, the identity politics. People want to get leadership and power using the method of divide and rule. Us and they. America practices it. Western countries practice, Europe practices it. In India, the leaders are, the rulers are practicing it. So he says a community which is inspired by feelings of ill will towards other community is low and ignoble. I entertain the highest respect for the customs, laws, religious and social institutions of other communities. Nay, it is my duty, according to the teachings of the Quran, even to defend their places of worship if need be. Finally, brothers and sisters, Iqbal was knighted by England for his great intellectual works, so he is called Sir Iqbal. He was given, the banquet was given in his honor by the lords of England. And of course, some of them, look down on Islam and they ask him, you are a philosopher, you are an intellectual. Do you believe Quran is the work of God, God's word? Iqbal smiled and said, yes, I do believe Quran is the word of God. Not because it is revealed to Muhammad. Yes, it is revealed to Muhammad. But more importantly, every time I read it, I see it as a fresh revelation, experience it as a fresh revelation to me right now. Of course, the same was said by Anna Marie Schimmel. She was not a Muslim, but she believed in the divine origin of the Quran. She said, no matter how many times you hear a verse of the Quran, every time, you know, it impacts your heart as if it is a fresh revelation, as if it is revealed right now in this very predicament that we are facing in life. Brothers and sisters, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us. I have only touched, superficial aspects of the deep thought of Allama Iqbal, and there is a need for a series of lectures on his life and his career and his thought. This was only just to show you, to inspire you to study him more so that we can motivate ourselves and our youth and new generations. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. I have I have to respond to some of the questions that was presented to me last time. One of the question was how Abdul responded to the pan-Islamism of Sultan Abdul Hamid. As far as I know, that Abdul had become, he differed with Afghani. Afghani was the pan-Islamist until the end, and he died in Istanbul because he went to. He thought that Sultan Abdul Hamid, he wanted to cooperate with him to unite the Muslim world under the banner of Islam. And of course, he died in mysterious circumstances. We are not here to go into the details of what happened, but he died there. Some say he was poisoned, God knows. By who? God knows. But anyway, but as far as Muhammad Abdu is concerned, he differed with Afghani because on the method of accomplishing, the goal was the same, but he thought that it should start with moral training and education and reviving the Islamic thought and changing the curriculum. So he was focused on that, and we don't know whether he made any overtures to Abdul Hamid, Sultan Abdul Hamid, or not. I couldn't find anything in the sources I've read. Uh, so now, what is pantheistic Sufism? Pantheistic Sufism is, Sufism that interprets, the world and God are one, so they are diffusing, this distinction between the creator and the creation. In Islam, this there is a distinction between the creator, who is transcendent, is beyond the creation, and the creation, which is the creation work of God Almighty. And man will always remain man, and God will always remain God. And there is no room there for incarnation and tadarru lahuti bin nasut, the divinity taking on the cloth of humanity and things like that. So Islamic Tawheed is different. Uh, any other question we have? I don't previous episode. There is another question about the concept of Maula in Islam. Of course, the whole concept of Maula, where Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam referred to Ali as his Maula, it was in response to some of the complaints that he heard against Ali radiallahu anhu. So in order to you know uh, resolve this, put to rest these complaints against Ali radiallahu anhu, the Prophet said, Ali, whoever is uh, Ali is my Mawla. So the it was intended not to indicate that Ali is going to be the successor to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as some people interpret it. There is nothing like that, because if it had been the case, the prominent companions of the Prophet, including Ali, would not have given bayah to Ali, to Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu. Ali himself recognized the genuine status of Abu Bakr, Caliphs Abu Bakr and Omar and Usman as well. Uh, so Allama Iqbal and some early reformers recommended a non-literal reading of Quran to avoid science conflict. This was similar to Christian reformist approach to Bible. Well, you know, I don't non-liberal, literal. Yes, definitely, it's against the literal interpretation of Quran. Definitely, and but I don't think it is comparable to what Christians did, the reformist approach of the Christians to the Bible. This is altogether a different topic. I don't want to you know uh, enter into that kind of discussion. But definitely Iqbal, Muhammad Abdu, Muhammad Asad, and all the personalities we are going to discuss, including the Ras and Muhammad al-Ghazali, and also Aisha bint Shati, and others that we are going to cover. They looked at Quran, they interpreted Quran not literally, but looking at the message of the Quran. They wanted to decipher the universal message, the lessons of the Quran, so that they can adapt the message to our modern times. Okay, so inshallah, I don't see any other question. Is there any other question? So, inshallah, we will conclude this session. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Glory and praise be to Allah. We bear witness there is no God but you. We ask forgiveness of you and return to you in repentance. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I hope to see you in the next session and we talk about Muhammad Asad. He's a very, very interesting personality. He was a friend of Iqbal, Allama Iqbal.